Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive, your shortcut to getting well-informed, custom-tailored just for you based on this stack of sources right here. Today, we are diving into a really significant and, let's be honest, pretty technical piece of EU law.
That's right. We're cracking open EU Regulation 2023 Young 670. If you use a smartphone, a tablet, or maybe even a cordless phone, this regulation is designed to directly impact the devices in your pocket and on your desk.
And our mission, pulling from these articles and reports, is to cut through the complexity. We want to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight so you walk away understanding exactly what this regulation is, why it came about, and what it means for making your devices last longer and be easier to fix.
Yeah, it's a key move towards a more circular economy for electronics. But as our sources reveal, it's also sparked some pretty heated debate, especially as it gets closer to implementation.
Hmm. So let's start at the beginning then. Why did the EU feel the need to regulate in this space? What core problems does this tackle according to the sources we've got?
Well, the big picture painted in the sources is the escalating environmental cost of our digital lives. Think about the sheer volume of mobile phones and tablets we produce, use, often quite briefly, and then discard. There's massive energy and material consumption involved, right from mining the resources to manufacturing.
And a huge part of that problem comes down to, well, things just not lasting.
Exactly. Premature obsolescence. It's really framed as the central villain here. Devices that fail or become effectively useless long before their potential lifespan is up. And this isn't just annoying for you as a user, it's a colossal waste of valuable resources. We're talking critical raw materials that are hard to get, often harmful to extract. When devices aren't easily repairable or recyclable, all that value is just lost.
Okay, so what are the specific culprits? What makes them die early, according to these sources?
There are several key issues pinpointed. First, devices often just aren't durable enough. They're susceptible to drops, scratches, or everyday things like dust and water getting in.
Right, the cracked screen problem.
That's a big one. Then, poor battery longevity. They degrade too quickly. And then there's the fundamental difficulty in actually taking devices apart to repair them. It frustrates everyone, from professional shops to, someone just trying to DIY fix at home.
It often feels like they're glued shut, doesn't it?
Precisely. The sources also point to insufficient or untimely operating system updates. You might have perfectly good hardware, but if the software isn't supported, the device becomes insecure or just functionally outdated pretty fast.
Yeah, that's a common complaint.
And finally, two major barriers for repair itself: a lack of necessary information for repairers and users, and when parts are available, they can be prohibitively expensive. So expensive it makes more sense economically just to buy a new device.
Which defeats the whole purpose. Okay, so the problem is clear. Devices aren't built to last, aren't easy to fix, and aren't supported long enough. What does Regulation 2023-1670 actually do about it? What are its main goals, and what products does it cover?
Right. The full name is quite a mouthful. Commission Regulation EU 2023-1670, laying down eco-design requirements for smartphones, mobile phones, cordless phones, and slate tablets. They stick to calling it 2023-1670, or the regulation.
Much better. And its core purpose. What's it trying to achieve?
Primarily, it aims to harmonize resource efficiency standards across the EU, create a level playing field, prevent different countries from having conflicting rules. But the big environmental goal is to significantly enhance the performance and reduce the footprint of these specific products.
So standard rules across the board and making things greener makes sense.
And there's a crucial social aspect, too, empowering you, the consumer, with the better information. The idea is you can make more sustainable choices when you're buying or deciding whether to repair your existing device.
Which specific devices fall under its scope, then?
You cover smartphones, feature phones, that's what the sources call the non-smart mobile phones, cordless phones, and slate tablets placed on the EU market.
Are there any devices that don't have to follow these rules? Any exclusions?
Yes, there are a few. Devices with flexible or rollable displays are currently excluded. Also, smartphones designed specifically for high-security communication, and it's worth noting, cordless phones were recently excluded from a separate energy consumption regulation, 2023-8-2016, so this Ecodesign rule is now the main one for them.
Okay, right. So here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Let's dive into the specifics from Annex 2. These are the concrete requirements that kick in from June 20, 2025. What are the key things manufacturers must do to make these devices last longer and be, well, fixable?
One of the absolute biggest shifts is around spare parts. The regulation mandates that manufacturers must make specific spare parts available for a full 7 years after the last unit of a model is sold in the EU.
7 years, that's a massive change compared to current practice for many devices, right?
Absolutely. It's a legal guarantee of support. Now, the sources clarify there are actually two lists of parts. One list is specifically for professional repairers. Think things like batteries, cameras, charging ports, buttons, speakers, microphones, internal hinges, more complex components.
Okay, probably stuff the average person shouldn't be messing with anyway.
Right. But then there's a separate list of parts that must be available for both professional repairers and end users like you. This typically includes the battery, the back cover, the display assembly, the charger, if one was included with the device, and SIM or memory card trace.
So some key parts are intended for anyone to replace. That's quite something.
Yes, that's the baseline. Unless, and this is an important condition, manufacturers meet certain high thresholds for durability and protection. For batteries, for instance, manufacturers can limit availability just to professionals only if the battery is designed to be very long-lasting, like retaining 80% capacity after 800 charge cycles for smartphones. And the device has a high level of protection against dust and water, specified by an IP rating like IP67 for smartphones.
Ah, okay. So if the battery is already super durable and the phone is really well sealed, maybe you don't need to be able to change the battery yourself quite as easily. Is that the logic?
That seems to be the thinking behind that condition, yeah. And manufacturers can't just, make parts technically available somewhere obscure. They have to publish information on their website for that full 7 years, including a clear list of the available parts, how to order them, and importantly, indicative pre-tax prices in euro.
Price transparency. That's huge. No more mystery pricing where a simple part costs almost as much as a new phone.
Exactly. It tackles that economic barrier we mentioned. And once you order, there are deadlines. Parts must be delivered within 5 working days for the first 5 years the model was on the market, and within 10 working days for the remaining 2 years of that 7-year support period.
Okay, parts are available, priced transparently, and delivered reasonably quickly. But you also need instructions, right? How do you know how to fix it?
Absolutely crucial. Repair and maintenance information must also be accessible for 7 years. For professional repairers, this is pretty extensive. We're talking detailed disassembly maps, circuit diagrams, diagnostic tools, software updates needed for repair, access to necessary data. Manufacturers can ask for proof of competence from professionals like qualifications or insurance, but the registration process itself has to be free. They might charge for access to the detailed info or updates, though.
And for the rest of us, the DIY crowd trying to replace those end-user parts like the battery or back cover.
For those specific parts, simple, clear repair instructions must be made publicly available on the manufacturer's website. Free access.
How easy do the devices themselves need to be to take apart? Are we talking tiny, weird screws and lots of glue?
Well, the regulation requires devices to be designed for non-destructive disassembly, using basic or commercially available tools. It does differentiate a bit. What's basic for a professional might be different from what's expected for an end user trying to swap a battery. Fasteners like screws should ideally be removable and reusable or replacement supplied.
And battery replacement is specifically called out again here.
Yes, there are specific conditions and steps outlined for battery replacement, depending on whether an end user or a professional is doing it. And it ties back to those durability and IP reading criteria we talked about.
Got it. The sources also highlight requirements for preparation for reuse, including handling data. What's that about?
This is a key point for the secondhand market and recycling. Devices must include a mandatory software function for a secure factory reset and data erasure. For smartphones and tablets, since data is typically encrypted by default these days, this must include securely erasing the encryption key, so you can be confident your personal data is wiped properly.
That's really important for privacy.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And also, you, the user, on smartphones and tablets, must be able to access battery management data. Things like the battery's manufacture date, when it was first used, the number of charge cycles it's been through, and its current state of health, its capacity.
Oh, that's incredibly useful. Knowing your battery's actual health could save a lot of guesswork. There's also something mentioned about serialized parts being an issue.
Yes, this tackles a practice often called parts pairing. It's identified in the sources as a major anti-repair hurdle. Serialized parts are components linked by software to a specific device. Sometimes, even if you swap in an identical, genuine part from another device, it won't work properly unless the manufacturer authorizes or pairs it via software.
Yeah, I've heard of that. It basically locks repairs to the manufacturer or their authorized network.
Exactly. The regulation tackles this by requiring manufacturers to provide non-discriminatory access to the tool, software, firmware, whatever is needed to ensure that replaced serialized parts function fully. And this access should be for both professional repairers and potentially end users doing their own repairs.
So they're not outright banning parts pairing yet, but they're saying manufacturers can't use software locks to block independent or self-repair using genuine parts.
Correct, for now. That's the gist. And the sources mention a review clause in the regulation explicitly flags a potential future prohibition of parts serialization altogether. It's definitely signaling that the EU is watching this practice very closely.
That's fascinating. It really feels like they're addressing specific tactics that right-to-repair advocates have been highlighting for years. Okay, let's shift from repairability to just basic toughness. What are the requirements for how durable these devices must be?
Right, this aims to prevent accidental damage leading to premature disposal. For phones and smartphones, there's a drop resistance test. They have to survive 45 repeated free falls onto a hard surface without losing essential functionality. There are modifications for foldable phones, naturally.
45 drops. Wow, that feels like a pretty realistic simulation of, well, my life with a phone.
Hopefully, it translates to fewer cracked screens and broken casings. Screens themselves must also have a certain level of scratch resistance, specifically Mohs hardness level 4, although there are some exceptions for certain foldable displays.
Okay. What about dust and water?
Protection is mandated too, generally specified by IP ratings or equivalent protection levels. For example, protection against solid objects bigger than 1 millimeters, and splashing water for phone smartphones, and resistance to accidental water spills for tablets.
And battery life. Is endurance guaranteed in some way?
Yes, there are minimum benchmarks for battery endurance while retaining 80% of its original capacity. It's 500 charge cycles for the simpler feature phones and, crucially, 800 cycles for smartphones and tablets.
800 charge cycles before dropping below 80% capacity. That's a significant lifespan guarantee for a smartphone battery, isn't it?
It really is. It should mean batteries last much longer before needing replacement. The regulation also encourages battery health management features. Devices should offer an optional smart charging feature that limits charging to, say, 80%, with a clear message to you that doing this helps extend the battery's overall lifespan.
Ah, like the feature some phones have now.
Exactly. And the default setting when charging fully should be to stop at 100%, only resuming charging if the level drops below 95% to avoid trickle charging stress.
Okay, so hardware durability and battery life are covered. What about software? Lack of updates is a huge reason perfectly good hardware feels obsolete or insecure.
A major point. And this regulation steps in here too. Manufacturers must provide OS updates that include security patches, bug fixes, or actual functionality updates for a minimum of 5 years. And this is crucial. It's 5 years from the date the last unit of a specific model is placed on the market, and these updates must be provided at no cost.
5 years of guaranteed updates from the end of sale date. That's potentially much longer support than many devices get currently. That's a huge shift.
It is. And the updates also have timeliness requirements. Critical security or corrective updates must be available within 4 months of the underlying software provider, like Google for Android, or the manufacturer releasing them. Functionality updates need to arrive within 6 months.
What about the classic problem? You get a big new OS update and suddenly your older phone slows down to a crawl.
They thought of that too, at least for smartphones and tablets. The regulation directly addresses this. Functionality updates are not allowed to negatively impact the device's performance unless you explicitly consent before installing the update.
You have to agree to potentially slower performance.
Yes. And if you do consent, and the update does cause a significant performance hit, the manufacturer is required to provide a free modification to the OS, maybe a rollback option or an optimized version to restore the previous level of performance.
Wow, that's a big win for consumers who've been frustrated by update-induced slowdowns over the years.
Okay, what about the end-of-life stage? Are there rules for marking materials for recycling?
Yes, basic stuff, but important. Plastic components over 50 grams must be marked with a material type to help with sorting and recycling. And dismantling information that's relevant for recyclers under the WE directive, that's the EU's main law on waste electrical and electronic equipment, must be available online for 15 years after the product stops being sold. 15 years for dismantling info, okay? What about specific information that manufacturers have to provide upfront to users or just make publicly available?
There's quite a detailed list for the manufacturer's website, again, for that 7-year period. This includes the weight range of specific critical raw materials used, like cobalt and neodymium. Also, the indicative recyclability rate of the device and the amount of recycled content it contains. They must also clearly state the IP rating for water and dust protection, and that guaranteed minimum battery endurance, the 800 cycles, for example.
And for users, in the instructions.
Instructions need to cover proper battery maintenance, explain the benefits of any smart charging features offered, and explicitly include a message explaining why chargers aren't always included anymore, tying into the common charger rules and confirming that standard USB-C chargers will generally work. Smartphone and tablet users also need clear instructions on how to access that battery health data we mentioned, and confirmation that their personal data is encrypted by default on the device.
Wow, okay. That is a really comprehensive package of rules. It feels like it touches on almost every major complaint people have had about phones and tablets not lasting or being hard to fix. Now, where does this specific regulation, 2023-1670, fit into the bigger picture of EU law? Is it standalone?
That's a good question. This specific rule is actually an implementing measure. It was created under an older framework, the Ecodesign Directive from 2009. But the overall landscape is rapidly evolving right now.
Ah, because there's a new, much bigger piece of legislation coming in, right? The ESPR.
Exactly. The Ecodesign for Sustainable Products Regulation, or ESPR, it actually entered into force in July 2024 and is set to eventually replace that old 2009 directive. And the ESPR is far broader. It covers almost all physical goods placed on the EU market, not just energy-related ones like the old directive. And it addresses a wider range of sustainability aspects: durability, reusability, recycled content, carbon footprint, repairability.
So this phone and tablet regulation, 2023-1670, it's like one of the first really detailed examples of the kind of rules we'll see under the new, broader ESPR umbrella.
You could definitely see it that way. Think of it as a precursor, setting a detailed example for a specific, high-impact product group. The ESPR also introduces the much-talked-about concept of a digital product passport, which is expected to start becoming operational around July 2026.
The DPP, right?
Yeah, this will be a digital record linked to each product, containing standardized sustainability and circularity data, and the data requirements we just discussed in 2023-68070, like the critical raw material info, battery data, recyclability rates. They're essentially laying the groundwork for that digital product passport for these devices.
Okay, that connects the dots nicely. How does this phone and tablet regulation interact with other existing EU laws? You mentioned the common charger. What about the big new batteries regulation?
That's actually a point of some debate highlighted in the sources, particularly from industry. Groups like Digital Europe argue that for devices like phones and tablets, this specific eco-design regulation, 2023-68070, is actually more stringent and tailored regarding battery requirements, things like replaceability being linked to those IP ratings, and the specific 800-cycle guarantees than the more general batteries regulation. That's 2023-1542.
So the phone rule is tougher on batteries than the battery rule.
In some specific ways for these products, yes. So they advocate for the legal principle of lex specialis. Basically, the more specific law, this Ecodesign one for phone tablets, should override the general one, the batteries regulation, where there might be overlap or potential conflict. They want clarity for compliance.
That makes sense. You'd want the rule specifically designed for the product you're making to be the main one you follow on those points. What about cybersecurity rules? Any interaction there?
Yes. Consumer groups, like BEUC, make a strong connection here. They link the 5-year minimum OS update duration required by this Ecodesign regulation, 2023-1670, to the software support period that will be required by the upcoming Cyber Resilience Act, or CRA. Their argument is that this 5-year period, driven by sustainability and functionality needs, should be seen as the absolute floor for security support under the CRA, not the ceiling. They argue security updates should ideally be guaranteed for the entire expected lifetime of the device, which might even be longer than 5 years.
Interesting. So using the sustainability rules update requirement as leverage or a baseline argument for longer security updates under a different law. Clever linkage. Now, let's talk about something that sounds quite surprising, which the sources revealed. This regulation was adopted, but then there was talk of needing a corrective act almost immediately. What's going on there?
Yes. This is where things get pretty controversial, especially given the timing just before the main rules are set to apply in June 2025. Shortly after the main regulation was adopted, a draft corrective act was proposed by the Commission to fix some identified errors or inconsistencies in the original legal text.
Okay, what kind of errors were they supposedly trying to fix? Just typos?
According to the notification, which went out in April 2025, with a comment period ending literally just days before the June 20th application date, It aimed to correct details concerning the maximum delivery time for certain spare parts. And also, crucially, to address what was described as an issue with the disassembly requirements for the display assembly. The sources say it was erroneously included in two separate sections of the original text, causing confusion. There was also something about aligning battery replacement disassembly rules.
Okay, on the surface, that sounds like technical tidying up, fixing drafting mistakes. But the sources point to some major concerns about this proposed correction.
This is the absolute core of the controversy, highlighted very strongly by groups like the Right to Repair Europe Coalition. They argue that the proposed correction, specifically the change relating to the display assembly disassembly, actually has the practical effect of abolishing the requirement for user replaceable displays.
Wait, hang on. Abolishing user replacement, even though the original regulation, as we just discussed, listed the display assembly as a part that must be supplied to both professionals and end users. How does that work?
Precisely. That's the contradiction Right to Repair Europe is pointing out. Their critique is that while the regulation still requires manufacturers to sell display assemblies to end users, the proposed correction alters the disassembly requirements section in such a way that it effectively makes changing the display a professional-only job in practice. You wouldn't have the right to instructions or design that facilitates easy user replacement.
So you could buy the screen, but you couldn't reasonably install it yourself according to the rules.
That's their interpretation of the effect. They call it a significant watering down of the regulation's original ambition and argue it creates an incoherent situation. Why mandate supply to end users if you then make end-user replacement practically impossible through the disassembly rules?
That definitely sounds like a classic right to repair battleground issue. Why is user replaceability for displays specifically so important to these groups?
They emphasize that a damaged screen is one of the single most common reasons people ditch a perfectly functional smartphone. Allowing users to easily and affordably replace the display assembly themselves was seen as having huge potential for extending smartphone life significantly and reducing e-waste. Removing that possibility, they argue, is a major step backward, just as the rules are meant to come into force.
So, what looks like a technical correction is being framed by advocates as fundamentally undermining a key policy goal of the regulation itself. Have they proposed an alternative fix?
Yes. Right to Repair Europe proposed alternative wording for that section of the correction. They believe their wording would fix the original drafting error or duplication without sacrificing the principle of user-replaceable displays. They also noted, interestingly, that the draft correction didn't address another apparent duplication they found in the original text regarding battery availability conditions. It just shows how incredibly complex drafting these technical regulations can be, and how a seemingly small change in wording can have major real-world consequences for repairability.
Absolutely. Every word matters. So, setting aside the ongoing debate over that correction for a moment, what are the overall anticipated impacts of the regulation as originally adopted? Who stands to benefit and who has to make adjustments?
The Commission's Impact Assessment Report, which was done before adoption, projected several key outcomes. Environmentally, the benefits are expected to be quite significant. Almost 14 terawatt-hours of primary energy savings annually by 2030 across the EU. Also, reduced e-waste generation and better recovery of those valuable critical raw materials.
Those are pretty tangible environmental gains. What about economically?
The assessment sees a positive impact for the repair and maintenance sector, particularly for small and medium enterprises, SMEs. They expect growth due to increased demand for repairs as devices are kept longer. The flip side, which is acknowledged, is a potential decrease in new device sales if products genuinely last longer and the overall number of devices in use stays roughly stable.
Right. People might buy fewer new phones if their old ones last longer and are repairable.
Exactly. And manufacturers will definitely face increased costs for R&D to meet the new design standards, for setting up compliance systems, and for establishing the spare parts, logistics, and information websites required.
So, potentially a shift in economic activity from just manufacturing new devices towards supporting and repairing existing ones. And what about the social impacts for us, the users?
The big anticipated win is consumer empowerment. You should get more durable, more repairable products, and clearer information up front, including things like that repairability score that comes with the related energy labeling rules for these products. Now, there might be slightly higher upfront purchase costs for some devices initially, as manufacturers factor in the R&D and durability requirements. But the overall aim is a lower total cost of ownership over the device's lifetime, assuming it lasts longer and repairs are actually affordable when needed.
That makes sense if a device lasts, say, 7 years instead of 3. Even paying for a repair or two down the line might well be cheaper than buying 2 or 3 brand new devices over that same period. How will these rules actually be enforced on the ground?
Enforcement is primarily handled at the national level. Market surveillance authorities in each EU member state are responsible for checking if products comply. The broader ESBR framework, under which these rules will eventually sit, includes plans for national action plans and potentially minimum check levels to try and ensure consistent enforcement across the whole EU. It's a perennial challenge.
What happens if a manufacturer is caught not playing by the rules? What are the penalties?
Under the ESPR framework, penalties must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. The most direct consequence is pretty stark. Non-compliant products simply cannot be placed on the EU market. They can be stopped at the border or withdrawn.
So market access is the big stick.
It is. Beyond that, penalties can include significant fines and, potentially for persistent offenders, even things like temporary exclusion from bidding on public procurement contracts or accessing public funding. And the sources also mention an increased risk of civil liability. This means consumers, perhaps banding together in collective actions, could potentially sue manufacturers for damages if a device doesn't meet the promised durability or repairability requirements laid out in the regulation.
Interesting. So not just government penalties, but the potential for direct consumer lawsuits adding pressure. Okay, let's quickly recap the different stakeholder perspectives we saw threaded through the sources. How do the key groups view these new rules?
Right. Consumer organizations, like BEUC, are generally strong supporters. They're pushing for the durability and longevity requirements to be robustly enforced. They see the 5-year OS update as a crucial baseline, not an endpoint. And they strongly advocate for consumer rights and effective redress if the rules are broken.
So they're focused on making sure consumers genuinely benefit and are protected by the regulation.
Exactly. Then you have the environmental NGOs and the right to repair groups like Right to Repair Europe and ECOS. They're pushing for maximum ambition. They see the regulation as a good step forward, but argue it could have gone further. They want stricter requirements, things like making all spare parts available to all users, demanding fully transparent and capped part pricing to guarantee repair affordability, and ideally an outright ban on practices like part serialization or pairing.
They're the ones constantly pushing the boundaries and calling out perceived weaknesses or loopholes, like with the Corrective Act.
Precisely. They've been particularly vocal and critical about that draft Corrective Act, seeing it as a potential major setback for user repairability right at the finish line.
And what about the industry perspective? Manufacturers and their associations like Digital Europe or the GSMA.
Industry groups generally state support for the overall goals of circularity and sustainability, but they consistently highlight the complexities and challenges of implementation. They argue for clear, consistent, and predictable rules, hence their point about lex specialis regarding the batteries regulation overlap, wanting clarity on which rule applies where. They often emphasize the importance of balancing design innovation for durability with the need for robust professional repair networks, sometimes implicitly questioning the feasibility or safety of widespread end-user repair for complex electronics. And they stress that making the circular economy work requires collaboration across the entire value chain: manufacturers, operators, recyclers, and consumers, and needs to be economically viable to be sustainable in the long run.
So they're focused on wanting the rules to be practical, technically feasible, predictable for business planning, and ultimately support a sustainable business model for everyone involved.
That's a fair summary of their position, yes.
Okay, so to bring this all together then, Regulation 2023-1670 is clearly a landmark piece of legislation for the electronics sector in Europe.
It really is. It's taking these broad principles of the circular economy, making things last longer, making them fixable, using resources better, and turning them into legally binding technical requirements for some of the most common and most frequently replaced products we all use every single day.
It's definitely going to require significant adjustments for manufacturers and how they design, build, and support their products. It presents real opportunities for the independent repair sector. And hopefully it delivers more durable, longer-lasting, and repairable devices into users' hands.
Absolutely. But navigating the sheer technical detail, ensuring effective and consistent enforcement across 27 countries, and resolving these ongoing debates, like the one over the Corrective Act and user-replaceable screens, will be absolutely crucial to its ultimate success. It's a really complex dance involving technology, logistics, policy choices, and ultimately consumer behavior and rights.
Indeed. So, as these main rules officially take effect now in June 2025, and that debate over potential last minute corrections continues right up to the deadline, perhaps the final thought for you, our listener, is this. What stands out to you most about this ambitious vision of a future where our tech is designed to last and be repaired? And do you think the practical reality of enforcement and market changes will ultimately live up to the significant promise laid out in this regulation?